This is Lois Harrington, an interviewer with the American Airpower Heritage Museum. The date is July 26th, 1996. I'm interviewing Mr. John Higgins.
My name is John W. Higgins, Higgins. The W is for Webb, W-E-B-B, which is my mother's maiden name. I was born in Salt Creek, now known as Midwest, Wyoming, on February 4th, 1923. The intervening period from my birth until finishing high school was spent primarily in Natrona County, Wyoming, near Casper, and most of it on a ranch, going to country schools. I graduated from high school in 1941 at Casper, Wyoming. It was known as NCHS, which stands for Natrona County High School. I enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps when I was attending school at Tucson, Arizona, at the University of Arizona. I saw the National Guard march to the railroad station one day and decided that I should do my part. So I volunteered into the U.S. Army Air Corps. I took my basic training at more than one location. Some of it was at Santa Ana, California, and most of the rest of it was at Ellington Field in Houston, although there was an intervening period. In order to keep us busy, they sent us to gunnery school at Harlingen Army Air Base in extremely southern Texas. In fact, I think it's the most southern point in the United States. I graduated from navigation school at Ellington Field, which is where I completed my advanced aerial navigation. I can't remember any funny anecdotes, although I'm sure there were many. But my memory of the war and all associated with it, and perhaps I should say everything associated with it, is a combination of sadness and happiness. There was good and bad. I think for the most part, I came out a better man. I can't recall the month or the date of my going overseas. However, I flew in an airplane, I believe it was a B-24, making several stops for fuel, taking the North Atlantic route. And when arriving overseas, I joined my crew at either Attlebridge or Attleboro, I'm not sure of the name, England, which is north of Norwich in East Anglia. East Anglia is the portion of England that juts out into the North Sea and is virtually directly across the channel from Calais, France. I don't remember my service pay. I think initially it was $44 a month, And when I left the service, I believe my salary was in the neighborhood of $500 to $600 a month as an officer. Most of the time in the Army, we received good food. There were some occasions, however, when the food really was barely edible, if at all edible. The best food I've ever eaten in my life, I believe, or certainly as good as any I've ever eaten at home, was at Ellington Army Air Base in Houston, Texas. They had cooks and chefs from the Waldorf Astoria in New York City that were running and operating all the mess halls, and we were treated very well and received excellent food. The opposite of that occurred several places where the food was terrible, and as far as I'm concerned, shouldn't have been fed to human beings. But when you are hungry and you need nutrition, you will eat almost anything, I discovered. I flew my tour of duty in B-24s, which is a four-engined aircraft. The engines were Pratt and Whitney, which at that time were considered to be the best. The B-24 was considered a very dangerous airplane by many people in the service and those outside the service. I didn't find that to be the truth, although perhaps the reason for that is that I had an excellent pilot and an excellent crew overall. My pilot was Louis Charles Weiser, W-I-E-S-E-R. He was a graduate of West Point and was the best leader that I was associated with in the entire war. Major Weiser, I believe, was his rank when we lost him. He may have been a light colonel at that time, I'm not sure. However, he bailed out of his airplane. I was not with him. I had completed my mission, and he was flying as a command pilot, leading a mission to bomb Regensburg. He was seen to bail out and has never been found or heard from since. I visited his parents when I returned from overseas. This was a very difficult experience. Nevertheless, I'm very glad that I made it a point to visit with them and tell them all about their son, Louis Charles Weiser. On a more delightful note, we nicknamed him Bud. I was discharged at Lowry Field in Denver, Colorado. This was after spending about 3 months at Fort Lauderdale in Florida. I don't recall all the training I received there, but I had decided to make a career out of the military prior to going there. However, my experiences there at Fort Lauderdale turned me off, and before making final commitment to make the military my career, I decided against it and was transferred to Lowry Field, and shortly thereafter discharged. I'm not sure the month or date from memory, although it could be determined. I believe it was in October or November 1945. I received most of my college education, at least the latter part of it, under the GI Bill of Rights, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the greatest bill that was ever passed by our Congress. It helped millions of people, and not just those that attended school, but those who later became associated with them, and of course it helped their families. Select. I selected service in the U.S. Army Air Corps primarily because at the time I was living at Tucson, Arizona, and attending the University of Arizona. Davis-Monthan Field was nearby, and although I had never been around airplanes, or certainly not heavy bombers before, I became fascinated with them and decided that that was the branch of service I wanted. I made that decision one evening after watching a parade. The parade was the National Guard unit located at Tucson, marching down to the railroad station to get on the train, leave their families, and go to war. But in any event, I thought the U.S. Army Air Corps was the best choice, and one thing I had in mind was education. I felt that the training I got in the Air Corps would be more beneficial to me in later life. And it certainly was, especially my training in advanced navigation school. Much of the education and the knowledge that I learned in navigation school I have used throughout my life. I have no regrets about joining the Army Air Corps or entering the Army during World War II. Unfortunately, World War II was a necessary dilemma to stop at least two, and perhaps I should say three, men who were, in my judgment, mad, crazy. They were, of course, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and I can't recall Japan. I can't recall the name of the so-called king of Japan at that time. It didn't really make any difference in the final analysis, because they were thoroughly defeated, as were all of the Axis partners. I have never believed the stories that I've heard about how Adolf Hitler died. Benito Mussolini was supposed to have died of a heart attack. And the leader of Japan, whose name I can't recall, is now deceased. All three, in my judgment, were evil. Evil men. There's no telling how many thousands and millions of lives they adversely affected. And of course, millions lost their life because of these three individuals. I won't call them men. I'll leave that alone.
John, can you tell me a little bit about your training here in the U.S.? What type of planes? Were they brand new planes that had just come in?
No, they were not brand new planes. Most of them were heavily used airplanes that had been returned from overseas, and many of them were sort of war-weary. They had been flown in the Pacific, and of course they'd been repaired, and they were the best we could do. But what our Army and our government was doing, they were sending the new airplanes and good airplanes overseas, which is all fitting and proper. It's what they should be doing. But as far as the dangers of actual flying, the dangers unless you were actually on a bombing mission, were far greater in our training period over here in the States than they were overseas, simply because of the quality of aircraft we had to fly.
All right. Now, when you were in England, can you tell me something about the base where you were stationed?
Yes, I can tell you something about the base. I flew all my missions out of a base north of Norwich, England, in East Anglia. And I think the name of the base was Attlebridge. I'm not sure. There was also a base named Attleboro, but I think I was at Attlebridge. And by and large, we had good facilities there at that base. We had a good officers' club. By good, I mean clean, decent, good building. And for the most part, good food at the officers' mess, but it varied too. It wasn't always good, but most of the time it was pretty good food. I found Attlebridge, of course, was just a little village, maybe 300 or 400 people. So whenever we had a 2 or 3 day pass, we usually went into Norwich, which is a fairly good sized city up in East Anglia. And frequently we would, if we had a 3 day pass, we got off for that much time, we would go to London. Not always would we go to London, but we went there several times, and we took trips to places like Birmingham, Shakespeare's home, things of historical interest. So the time overseas, especially when we weren't flying, when we were off duty, was real good and good experience, and for the most part enjoyable.
Can you tell me a little bit about your uniforms
now? Yes, I can tell you something about the uniforms. They were The officers' uniforms were very good, I thought. They weren't the typical olive drab type of Army uniform that we wore when we were enlisted. And most of the uniforms we had tailor-made. And of course, being an officer, you had to pay for it yourself. But they were made out of real good and nice-looking, top-quality gabardine. And they weren't the typical olive green. They were more of a dark forest green. And of course, with the brass on them, they made an attractive uniform.
Now, what about your flying?
Flying
outfit?
uniforms, flying clothing that we had overseas, most of the time, we had electric heated suits to wear. But here in the States, we just got cold, and many times we got so cold that we couldn't write, couldn't keep a log. The pilot and co-pilot had heaters, built-in heaters up in their compartment. But when you got out of that, and of course you're flying up at 30,000 feet and it was 60 degrees or so below 0 Fahrenheit, you had to either dress so heavily that you could hardly move, which was true if you didn't have an electric suit, or you got cold, got frostbitten, and there were men who lost hands and feet because they got frozen and had to be amputated. Here in the States, in training.
Can you tell me about your number of missions and some of the anecdotes?
I can tell you something about going overseas, and I can't tell you many details on missions, but when we went overseas, we flew over mostly in B-24s, and I'm trying to remember the name of the field we departed from up in New Hampshire. But I do remember very distinctly that we had heard that there were no eggs overseas. You could get powdered eggs occasionally, but no fresh eggs. So our group decided we would take the egg machinery along with us, so to speak. And several of the B-24s had a dozen or so hens, and I think we took over 2 or 3 roosters. But we arrived anyway overseas with more than half of the chickens or the hens that we took. And they were an immediate problem after we landed, but we got a hold of the club officer, and we managed to hide these chickens from the commanding officer. The club officer was the one that ran the officers' club and the enlisted men's club. And he made a deal with a local farmer about, maybe 300 or 400 yards from the main gate of our base to keep those chickens, and we would either pay him or he could keep a certain percentage of the eggs. And I don't remember what deal we worked out, but it worked out satisfactory. And there at that base, in the officers' mess, we had fresh eggs most of the time during the war. And we were the envy of many other bases who had nothing but powdered eggs.
And how many missions did you have, John?
I flew 25 missions. That was the tour of duty that you flew when I went overseas. Later, I'd say about 2 or 3 months after I finished my tour, I think primarily because of the shortage of bombardiers and navigators and pilots, they increased that figure to 30 missions. But of course, the missions during the latter part of the war weren't near as dangerous as in the early part, so the 25 missions, particularly the earlier ones, were much more dangerous than those who had to fly 30, because the Luftwaffe was still in full regalia and had lots of airplanes, and they were far bigger or greater danger than the ground flak, or the anti-aircraft, in other words. At high altitude, flak was certainly a problem. Once in a while they made a direct hit. But the fighter planes, the Luftwaffe, that came up to meet us and greet us, were far more a problem and a lot more dangerous than the ground anti-aircraft or flak.
John, is there anything else you would like to put on your tape?
Well, I would like to emphasize that overall, although many people might think of it as a bad experience, which the war in totality certainly was, but individual experiences like mine, of those who survived without being seriously wounded or anything of that sort, I think, as I may have said previously, I think I came out of the service a much better man than I was when I went in, and certainly much better educated, much more mature than when I entered the service. So I don't consider that experience all bad. I certainly don't consider it a loss. I came out a much better man and a much wiser man than when I went in. When I went in, of course, I was really just a late teenager out of high school. But I'll guarantee you, compared to what I was when I went in, when I got out, I was a man.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We certainly appreciate you taking your time to give this interview to us at the museum.